What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the Season 1, Episode 3 review of Tron Uprising entitled The Renegade Part 2. And this episode actually came out early. I think it was released on the Disney XD website, and I actually watched it on a site called Anime Flavor. That's actually where I went to watch it. And I forget who recommended this site to me. Sorry, I forgot your name, but big shout out to you for directing me to that website so that I could watch this episode. But yeah, another great episode from Tron Uprising. Ladies and gentlemen, another fantastic episode. They're really going on a roll here, man, with these episodes. A lot of great characterization, a lot of great character development, just all around spectacular episode. So let's jump right into this. And first I want to talk about the aesthetics yet again. I have to talk about the aesthetics again because I just now realized something that I probably should have realized at first glance, but that I didn't realize and that I'm only picking up on now. So let's talk about the aesthetics. The aesthetics of Tron Uprising reminds me of a cyberpunk type feeling or a cyberpunk type atmosphere. And also a sort of dystopian type atmosphere as well. For those of you who don't know, cyberpunk is a scientific genre that was popularized probably in the late 80s, at least in America it was. And I think actually America is probably where it started. And if I can remember the guy's name, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Gibson. And he wrote the Sprawl trilogy. But anyway, cyberpunk is a genre of science fiction that focuses on the sort of negative impact that technology, that advancements in technology could have on the human condition specifically, but on society in a more general or more broader sense. And so cyberpunk really gives us some insight into, or tries to give us some insight into, the relationship between technology and society and how technology could lead to the breakdown of certain societal institutions. And foremost among those institutions is the government. So a lot of times you'll see cyberpunk sort of being integrated with dystopian literature. So that's what cyberpunk is. And the grid has this same dark, grim atmosphere. And it's, of course, about, future advancements in technology. In fact, the original Tron this was a time when the original Tron came out. I believe we were still years away from the first laptop computer, and this is when computer programming really started taking off, because a lot of you probably don't know this or remember this, but I know I don't remember it specifically, but computers used to take up buildings. I mean, that's how big computers used to be. They used to take up entire floors of buildings. And they used to have about the same amount of power, probably actually less power, than this calculator has. So when Tron first came out, it was dealing with technology that was, right on the cutting edge and right about to jump off. And the grid, I think, reflects this sort of dark, grim atmosphere, because one thing I noticed about the grid is that there's no light. There's no natural light in the grid. And I know that may seem odd, but it's very, very powerful symbolism. The fact that there's no light, that there is no sun in the grid. It always looks like it's nighttime in the grid. It always looks dark in the grid. And I think that that's very, very powerful symbolism for this sort of cyberpunk dystopian atmosphere that they have going on. And I haven't seen the original Tron movie, but I think it was a part of that original Tron aesthetic as well. But I might be mistaken about that. So now let's get into the summary / analysis portion of this review. So this episode picks up right where we left off, with Cutler and Beck about to face off in the games for their freedom. And before I continue, let me just talk about freedom for just a quick second. Very, very interesting ethical questions are being raised by this show. And while it's not too complex or too complicated because it's still a kid's show, it's still very, very interesting to see these sorts of questions being raised, because when Beck and Cutler are being made to fight basically for their own freedom, an interesting question is raised, which is this. Freedom, or maybe not a question, but an interesting sort of idea is being raised. That in this show, with the way people are being forced to fight in the games for the amusement of Tesla and Clue, but also for the other people who are participating in this, and yes, the audience are to a certain extent participators in this sort of in these games. The idea is being raised that freedom under these circumstances is being transformed into something that humans don't have by nature. It's not something that all humans are endowed with, and you might think about the Declaration of Independence here, but rather with respect to these games, and even the word games signifies this, that freedom is being transformed into a prize that can be won by the participants of this game. So it's not something that humans just are endowed with. It's not something that humans inherently possess. And so what happens under these circumstances is that your humanity, your freedom, which in a large part defines your humanity, at least I would think so, that your humanity literally becomes something that you have to borrow from the government. It's something that is, in a sense, loaned to you by the government, and it's something that can be revoked at any time. And this, I think this is going to continue to be another sort of motif throughout this, because the games are just a really, really important aspect of how the government dominates the people of Argon City. And so back to the summary portion. But Cutler and Beck, at first, they refuse to engage in the government's logic of oppression and domination. They refuse to fight each other. And in this sense, I think they retain a little bit of their freedom because they retain their choice. I mean, even under the most dire circumstances where it seems like you don't really have a choice, you always have a choice as a human being. And what Beck and Cutler initially decide to do is to refuse to fight. And so by refusing the government's logic, they in some sense retain some of their freedom because they won't be forced to do what the government wants them to do. And they won't be forced to comply. But Tesla responds to this by, he creates this sort of cylindrical, I guess you could call it that, cylindrical force field around Beck and Cutler. And the force field encloses them. And Tesla tells them, listen, you'll either fight like I want you to, or this force field will continue to close until it crushes you both, until you're both de-rezzed. And this is very interesting because Beck is being trained by Tron to defeat Tesla and possibly to defeat Clue as well, although it's not clear if that's going to be the outcome of this series. And yet he says he's the one, once Tesla, creates this force field, he says, Beck tells Cutler, listen, I'll sacrifice myself. You go on. You survive. And this is very, very interesting insight into Beck's sort of characterization and his character development. Because it's interesting because generally heroes are supposed to take on a larger than life persona. They're supposed to be not necessarily above the average person, but they're supposed to be capable of feats that the average person, or in this circumstance, the average program, wouldn't be able to do. And we even see some of that potential in Beck. And yet he's so humble, and his humanity is built on such self-sacrifice that even though he knows that he's being trained by Tron to eventually take on Tesla and take on Clue, he's willing to sacrifice himself so that Cutler can be saved. Very, very interesting aspect of his personality. And also of the sort of the way this show is sort of tweaking certain narrative conventions. And so Beck basically is trying to force Cutler to fight him so that, you know, he can be defeated. But once the fight begins, it's very clear that Beck is a better fighter than Cutler, and this was to be expected. I mean, Beck is being trained by Tron, as I just mentioned. So Cutler wants to so Cutler realizes that, you know, Beck is a better fighter than me. Maybe it's better if I sacrifice myself. So then Cutler wants to sacrifice himself. And again, this goes back to the themes of sacrifice and hope that were sort of touched on in the last episode. And but so Cutler wants to sacrifice himself, and so Tesla is becoming increasingly frustrated that these two programs aren't doing what he wants them to do and aren't abiding by his logic of domination. So he finally says, listen, if you don't do what I tell you to do, then you'll both be de-rest. I'm certainly happy to oblige both of you if you want to sacrifice yourself so much. I can put a stop to this and you can be de-rest. And so you can see that there's this sort of power struggle, even though both Cutler and Beck are in a position where it would seem like they're completely powerless. They're not completely powerless, because even now they're engaging in a power struggle with Tesla over their own freedom and over really their own humanity. And so, you know, Tesla wants them to submit, and Cutler and Beck are just refusing, basically. And so after Tesla tells them that he's, you know, happy to oblige them and de-res both of them, Page, the sort of field commander under General Tesla, I believe that's his title in the Army, General Tesla. Page, his field commander, points out that Tesla can't have them both de-res. And her reasoning is that Tesla has already promised one of them, at least one of them, their freedom, and that by reneging on his promise, that it would be bad for his image. And at first I thought this was somewhat contrived. I thought this was sort of a cheesy way to resolve this tension between Cutler and Beck and Tesla. But then I thought about it and I asked myself, why would Tesla's image matter? I mean, he's in a position of power. He doesn't have to abide by his own promises. He can break them if he wants to, and there's nothing that anybody can really do to him. And then I realized something. I realized that his image, that Tesla's image, and even to a certain extent Clue's image, because Tesla is the sort of emissary of Clue, that his image, having this sort of image of benevolence, is part of how he controls the people of Argon City and keeps them subservient. And so, you know, by keeping his promise and offering up this sort of fake benevolence, that he'll use his image of fake benevolence as a tool, as a device to try and keep the people of Argon City passive and submissive, because, you know, he doesn't want to seem like a complete monster, because that would lend itself to more rebellion and to more renegade and revolutionary actions. And so part of his fake benevolence is how he controls the people of Argon City. And so Tesla makes the decision, and he decides to free Beck, free him in quotes, and to have Cutler de-rest. And he's going to make it a public execution because, of course, he wants to make an example out of Cutler for sort of defying him. And this is also a very important aspect of this, at least of this episode, because the ability to dominate a person's body, and we see this throughout many, many examples of history, especially slavery, not just in America, but slavery in the Americas, we'll say, because slavery in the Americas was really different from slavery throughout all of history. But in any event, the ability to dominate a person's body reinforces in a very, very visceral way, the power of the government. And a lot of philosophers have talked about the relationship between the body and government power, and one of those philosophers is Michel Foucault. So if any of you are interested in that, You can pick up his book, Discipline and Punish, I believe is the title of that book. But in any event, the rest of the episode is basically about Beck donning his Tron persona and trying to free Cutler before he's not executed. That's not even a word. Executed by General Tessler. And so there's this prison break, this huge prison break that Beck attempts, and a huge chase scene that involves multiple regions of the city. It's very, very cinematic. And of course, the visuals and the fights and the choreography, and it's just absolutely awesome. I mean, at one point they're fighting on what looks like a shipping dock. Then they're fighting in another part of the city that looks like it's a slum type area, and then there's a chase scene on water boats, and it's just ridiculous how cinematic this fight and chase scene goes. And of course, the one who's trying to retrieve Cutler and bring him back to General Tessler so he can be executed is Paige, because Paige is, and for those of you who don't know, Paige is I believe she's the deuteragonist of this series. I'm almost certain she's the deuteragonist of this series. And boy, Beck and Paige, those fights are just, man, they get it in when they fight. I mean, they really, really get it in. Just really, really cinematic stuff. And so this fight and sort of chase scene that's happening in multiple areas of the city escalates. And Tessler actually at one point mobilizes all of his forces in the city. He has them on water boats so they can't escape by water. He has them on the bridge leading out to Argon City. I mean, it's just crazy. He set up roadblocks and just really, really crazy stuff. And at one point, it escalates to a point where Beck and Cutler actually have to be saved by the real Tron. I mean, that's how fierce this fighting gets. And but at the end of the episode, Beck is able to save Cutler. And now Cutler is going to be sort of a spokesman for the revolution, because he's going to sing the praises of the fact that he was rescued from General Tessler by Tron, who he thinks is Tron, rather, because he doesn't know that Beck is actually donning this Tron persona. So yeah, this series continues to surprise me. I continue to be delightfully surprised by this series. I mean, the way they integrate the philosophy and the action, how the first part of the episode was really raising ethical questions about, government power and authority and justice and freedom and humanity. But then the rest of the episode was just this huge cinematic fight and chase scene. I mean, I really love the way they've integrated those two elements into the show. And also, of course, I continue to love Beck's character development. So another great episode of Tron Uprising. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.